morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hill. I am a professor at Monash University Law School in Melbourne, Australia, and I would like to welcome you all to this conference. The COVID-19 crisis and its aftermath, corporate governance implications and policy challenges. I'd like to welcome you to the conference, and for those of you that are in different time zones around the world, Jonathan Macy, hello, welcome to Australia. So we're just starting the day here in Melbourne and Sydney with the panelists for this session. Just a few housekeeping matters before we get underway with our first panel. This is an initiative of the Global Corporate Governance Colloquia, the GCGC, and the European Corporate Governance Institute, the ECGI. And I have to say, you know, having a 24-hour session around the world is fairly ambitious. We are hoping that the technology goes seamlessly. It's been great the first 3 minutes. But if we do have any problems going along or technical glitches and you have to log out and log into the conference again for sessions that you're joining, apologies in advance, but hopefully we'll get over those as we go along. Also, be aware you can leave the conference to sleep, etc., and we look forward to seeing you at other parts of it. Questions. Now, we have a pretty tight-packed conference schedule here, but if you are one of the registered panelists over the sessions of the conference, you can raise your hand on your Zoom to ask a question. We will try to get to you. We can't promise. If you are an attendee who has registered for the conference, we would ask you to use the Q&A function so that you ask a question in writing, and if we can't get to it during the conference, we will certainly get back to you afterwards. We are recording this event and it will be published on the ECGI website, so if you miss sessions you can watch them later. And also I've been told to remind everyone that's not speaking on a particular panel, could you mute your microphones and turn off your video just to improve the quality, and also avoid using VPN or Wi-Fi if you can. You'll have better connection. So let's get underway, and my first very pleasant task is to introduce the first panel and the fabulous speakers on this first panel. So the panelists here, I have John Laker. Dr. John Laker is a member of the experts panel of the International Monetary Fund, and he is former chairman of the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority, or APRA. Then we have Diana Nicholson. Diana is a senior partner in the mergers and acquisitions team of King & Wood Mallesons in Melbourne, Australia. Stephen Turner. Stephen is our scientist on the panel, so welcome, Stephen. Steve is co-head of the Infection and Immunity Program and head of microbiology at the Monash Biomedicine Discovery Institute. So I just discovered Stephen is my colleague, and so thanks so much for being on the panel. And finally, Malcolm Edey, Dr. Malcolm Edey. He is an adjunct professor of economics at the University of Sydney, and he was the former assistant governor of the Reserve Bank of Australia. And in that role, he was also chair of the OECD Financial Markets Committee and a member of the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So we have a lot of expertise on this panel, and we're going to be looking at crises and the differential impact of crises across the globe. And it really is only, you know, just over 10 years since we all experienced the global financial crisis, and here we are in the midst of another great challenge to the world. Now, although the 2007 to 2009 financial crisis was described as global, in fact, its effects were rather different across different nations, and they were far more severe in the United States and in Europe than they were in Australia and in parts of Asia, which tended to weather that crisis considerably better. Now, the COVID-19 crisis is quite different. It's a much more complex crisis because it's a two-track crisis. We have both the health and the financial aspects of this crisis. And those two aspects are inevitably going to interact and affect one another as we try to make our way through this crisis and then make our way out of this crisis. So I'd like to start just with the health aspects and go to Steve Turner, our microbiologist. Steve, I saw you quoted quite extensively only 3 days ago in The Guardian, talking about how the origins of this crisis were quite uncertain. Can you just explain to us why we still don't really know as much as perhaps we would like to know about the origins of COVID-19?
Yeah, thanks, Jennifer, and thanks very much for bringing me along. I certainly feel out of my depth, so hopefully I can bring some value to it. Yeah, so the question of where this virus came from, it's a bit of a yes and no answer in the sense that we know that it came or is associated with wet markets in Wuhan, in the Hubei province in China. And what people have done have gone in and they've basically surveilled animal species in and around that area. And they've found that there are viruses. So the COVID-19 outbreak is caused by a virus called the coronavirus, which you're probably all familiar with. But this one's particularly interesting. It's related to the SARS outbreak that we had in the early 2000s, around 2003, but it's a different lineage, so it's almost like a cousin. And when you look for the sort of predecessors of that virus, there are predecessors that look like they're genetically related in bats that are in that area. The interesting thing is that they're not completely related, so they're like second cousins. So there's been some changes in the virus that's enabled it to jump from these animal species into humans. And that jump is really where the gap in knowledge is. We don't know. Even though this bat virus is the most related genetically to the current human virus that's in circulation, there is some other changes that needed to occur, and we just don't know where that virus came from. We haven't identified it yet. There were some reports that maybe a little mammal called the pangolin might have been that intermediary animal, so it sort of jumped through that. Again, that's a bit up in the air for two reasons. One is that the surveillance of those animals was done in a completely different part of China. So it was geographically quite distinct. So the viruses are in circulation, the pangolins, but they were nowhere near where this initial outbreak occurred. And there are other things is that there are characteristics. The pangolin viruses that are similar aren't as similar as the bat virus. So the bat virus is still more related to the human virus. So it's speculation at this stage, really, how the virus jumped from the animal reservoir, which was the bats, into humans.
And how important will determining that be to finding a cure and a vaccine?
Yeah, well, actually, it might not have any bearing on that, only in that we can understand potentially how further outbreaks might occur. Right. There's a general feeling that, this is probably something that'll only increase in frequency as, global population expands and we encroach on sort of ecosystems where these viruses are circulating.
Yeah. And Steve, just before I move on to the financial aspects, just the differential health aspects. Initially, it was uncertain whether we were going to see this spread pretty uniformly around the world, but just at different times. But it seems now that some jurisdictions will have quite differential health outcomes. And I just want to ask you about that. What are you seeing that is protecting some jurisdictions and really exacerbating the problem in other jurisdictions from a health perspective?
Yeah, it's a really important question, I think. So just to start that, we're seeing what's called exponential growth in the spread. So just to give you some figures, we just crossed 2 million cases yesterday. It took 2 weeks to go from 1 million to 2 million, and it took 3 months to get to 1 million. So with the exponential growth in this virus, it can spread really rapidly. So this is sort of what we've seen. And what's happened is that's put a lot of pressure on countries and particularly health systems. So everyone would be familiar, I'm sure, with this concept of trying to flatten the curve. And really what that means is just trying to make sure that the spread is slow enough that if people do get sick, that they have access to the healthcare that is going to be required to treat the most serious of cases. The access to critical care units and ventilators and the like is limited. So when you've got something that is sudden like this, that is rapidly spreading and is global in the way that it is now, it puts enormous pressure. And really, those jurisdictions that acted quickly and really put in quite strict mitigation policies, so social distancing, keeping people at home, banning travel, all those sorts of things, they seem to be more effective. And then on top of that, you've got places like South Korea, Singapore, which are actually kind of held up as really the model way of dealing with something like this, is they had something where they basically identified people who had the virus, and then they did what's called contact tracing. So any contacts or people they came into contact with, they were isolated and quarantined for 2 weeks. That requires a lot of investment, particularly in testing. So there's been a lot of debate here in Australia around whether or not we're doing enough testing. I can obviously answer questions around that if people are interested, but really that's where we're seeing differences. So those jurisdictions that have acted quickly and put in these, quite a lot of these kind of social mitigation policies are faring better in terms of the spread and their ability to cope with the health consequences of the infection.
Yeah. So what you're telling us is already having the financial wherewithal to throw it at this virus is helping certain jurisdictions. And of course, that was the point I made earlier about the global financial crisis, that some countries weathered it better at the time, and then some countries have, you know, come out of it better 12 years on, 13 years on than others. And so if I can just turn to my financial experts now, John and Malcolm, you were absolutely, you know, in the heart of things during the global financial crisis. And I just wonder if you could tell us what you thought were some of the most effective mitigating techniques during the global financial crisis, you know, that really protected some jurisdictions. And are they going to work for this crisis in terms of financial protection? John, do you want to kick off and then I'll ask Malcolm?
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer, and good morning to everybody, wherever you might be listening in. I'll give you a sort of a potted brief history of the Australian experience and the lessons from it. And Malcolm, who was a partner of mine through the crisis and on the Basel committee, can add his insights, if you don't mind, Malcolm. But you mentioned, Jennifer, that Australia and other countries went through the global financial crisis much less affected than others. And that's certainly true in the Australian case. We went into the crisis with a strongly growing economy. We were enjoying the fruits of a sustained mineral investments boom and a mineral export boom. We'd had an uninterrupted period of economic growth, low inflation. The budget was in surplus, and monetary policy was a little on the tight side of neutral going into the crisis. So there was room on the policy front to operate. The banking system itself was resilient. It was well capitalised. Our management of risk was further advanced than other jurisdictions and very conservative. So our banks weren't exposed to the toxic assets that were at the epicenter of the crisis in the US. But there was a vulnerability, and that was that our banking system was overly dependent on raising wholesale money in global financial markets, and at the shorter end of tenors. So we were dependent on offshore wholesale funding. And that was the vulnerability that came home to roost very quickly. So when the crisis, when the shocks hit from the US and in the first instance and from Europe, they came through the financial channel. The funding from offshore markets froze. Nobody ever expected that deep liquid wholesale markets would freeze, but they did to bank names, and our banks were not immune from that. So that's the financial channel. It hit hard. It required the government in the end to provide a guarantee on wholesale funding.
John, if I could just cut in for 1 second, for international listeners, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, that Australia's banking system is quite similar to Canada in that we've got very few big banks, you know, compared to many other countries. Is that fair enough?
True.
Yeah.
But in effect, what happened was that the banking system in Australia did not transmit the shocks that were coming from offshore. The shocks were not amplified when they hit Australia. The monetary and fiscal responses were aggressive. Monetary policy had the sharpest reduction in interest rates in Reserve Bank history. There was a fiscal stimulus, which was one of the largest at the time. So macroeconomic policy did the job. Banks remained conservative and continued to lend throughout the crisis. So intermediation continued. The slowdown was limited in duration. The impact on confidence, which is something which will come through in this discussion, I'm sure. Looking back on it, policymakers feel that the confidence factor was probably the most important and probably one of the hardest to quantify. And that took a long time to unwind. And this is an issue for policy in the COVID-19 experience. How long will confidence in the community take to return? So, you know, the lesson for us then was that our banking system was able to continue to do what banks are required to do in a crisis, which is to support activity. If you fast forward to today, some of the circumstances are different, but one thing that is even more clear, I think, is that in the decade since the crisis, a lot of effort's gone into building even stronger capital and liquidity buffers in our banks. That's part of the global Basel initiative. So the banks go into this crisis in Australia with record high levels of capital, much more liquid balance sheets, more stable funding for their loan books. And, you know, the community is expecting banks to support them through this severe disruption to economic activity, and they are.
Malcolm, have you got something to tell us from the Reserve Bank perspective from that period?
Yes, thanks, Jennifer. Yes, what John said about the nature of the crisis in Australia in international comparison is exactly right. We didn't have a recession and we didn't have a banking crisis in Australia, unlike many of the other advanced countries in the Northern Hemisphere. And when I talk about that, I usually sum that up by saying that it was a result of a combination of good luck and good management. The good luck side of it was that we are part of the Asian regional trading zone, and that served us in good stead with the strong demand for mineral resources and so on, the rapid recovery in China. And also, I think it was true that our banks were exposed to the sorts of risks that John described, but that was a risk that you could deal with by measures that would provide liquidity support to the banks. And I think we know how to do that. And if it happens again, we will know how to do that. The good management side, I think we did have a good policy response. We had plenty of scope for fiscal response, and that was used. The thing that was most effective there, I think, were the timely payments to households, because that's a way of resisting a contraction in spending. And the fastest thing you can do is just put money in the hands of households so that it can be spent. That worked. The monetary response, I think, helped a lot. We had big cuts in interest rates, plenty of liquidity support from the RBA. It's interesting to talk about how the current crisis might be different from the GFC. And I think it will be different in one very important way, and that is, this is mainly what macroeconomists call a supply shock rather than a demand shock. In the GFC, a whole lot of wealth was destroyed because asset markets crashed and people lost faith in the banks. They couldn't spend because they couldn't borrow from the banks. Most of those things work through contraction of demand. And when demand contracts, you can replace that with public spending. What we've got at the moment, though, is a big contraction in supply. We've got people just being told not to go to work. And you can't fully offset that just by spending more money. What you can do is try to mitigate the effects of it. And so the government is trying to do that by targeted payments to people who are missing out on income, so that they'll be able to meet their obligations, keep businesses open so that they can restart when the crisis is finished. But it's going to pose some awkward trade-offs because there'll be a certain amount of production and income that's just lost because people are not working, and you never get that back again. And that's going to pose some difficult trade-offs down the track for how we deal with that.
Yeah, well, I think it's interesting. Both you and John have raised this point about the way that the stimulus package in the global financial crisis was structured in Australia, and it was very unusual by international standards, is my recollection. Joseph Stiglitz praised Australia's stimulus package during the global financial crisis because it was very much about increased spending rather than giving tax cuts. And I think Australia had seen that just giving tax cuts was not that effective during the Asian crisis of the 1990s. And so there was this epithet during the global financial crisis: go hard, go early, go households, put money into people's hands. And of course, that's what the US is proposing to do at the moment with coronavirus. But it is a very different crisis, isn't it? You know, if people are worried about health costs in one country, giving them a certain amount of money is not necessarily going to perform the same role it did in the global financial crisis in Australia.
No, I think it won't stop production from falling now because people just can't go to their workplace and do their work. What it can do is it can keep people in a position where they can restart once the health crisis is alleviated, and it can also allow people to meet their obligations because they're accumulating unpaid rent or unpaid payments to their banks or things like that, and people need to be in a position where they can eventually make good on that, so that you don't get contagion to other institutions. And I think, I'm not an expert on what the government's currently doing at the moment, but on the face of it, it seems as though the payments that they're making are well targeted to achieving those sorts of results. Yeah.
John, did you have a comment on that?
Yes, what's unique about this crisis where we're in, as Malcolm's identified, is the disruption to supply. I mean, the estimates in the United States are something like 40% of discretionary expenditure just cannot now take place because people, and it's not just in the United States, it's globally, where there are lockdowns in place, cannot go to restaurants. They cannot travel. They cannot enjoy entertainment. And that discretionary expenditure, I don't know what the figures are for Australia, but I think in the US it's about 40%. So putting cash into the hands of the community is helpful for all the reasons that Malcolm provided. And the programs like JobKeeper are important, quite essential for maintaining economic relationships, maintaining the link between a worker and his employer through this uncertain but difficult lockdown period. So these are the knock-on effects from the health policy initiatives. These are very clear economic effects, which will take time to work through. What they also do, these support programs, is shore up confidence. Confidence that when the pandemic is ultimately contained, the community can regain its momentum, economic growth can pick up, and people will feel confident to go back and enjoy the pattern of expenditure they once had. So I think those payments are vital for dealing with this longer question about the recovery as well as getting people through the day-to-day demands of rents and fixed expenditures.
John, just for our international audience, if you could just say a couple of words about, what JobKeeper is.
Well, this is a subsidy to employers to keep employees on the workforce. It's a 6-month wage subsidy. It's similar in principle to the United Kingdom, but it's paid in a different way as a flat amount. In Australia, we use the language a bridge from the life before COVID-19 to what life will be like once the pandemic is contained. And this is part of the bridge. This is to get the infrastructure to preserve the productive capacity of the economy through this uncertain period so that it is able to respond quickly. when the social lockdown rules and other restrictions are gradually eased.
Yeah. And, you know, again, I think there are interesting parallels there with the global financial crisis, because Australia and Germany were quite unusual in there was much less by way of job losses, but more by way of reduced worker hours during the global financial crisis in both Germany and Australia. And this JobKeeper program, you know, is a different approach, but I think it's aiming at the same result. Just going back to, you know, the differential effect across different countries that we're going to see both from a health and an economic perspective. I just wanted to bring Diana in. Is Diana there? I can't see her picture. Are you there, Diana? Where is Diana?
Yes, I'm above you on my screen, Jennifer.
Excellent, Diana. I wanted to bring you in because I wanted to talk about national security issues. This idea that some countries might be brought to their knees at various times as this crisis unfolds, and concerns about national security. I mean, the Australian Prime Minister recently described the COVID-19 crisis as, quote, a risk to the nation's sovereignty. And interestingly, in Australia, we've had temporary changes to foreign investment approval rules recently, where approvals have been dropped down to zero, that the government just wants to be approving any foreign acquisitions. And you do a lot of cross-border merger work, and I just want to pass the floor to you at this point to talk about that.
Thank you. Well, I certainly think, Jennifer, that sovereign interests will be paramount because people are under an obligation to protect their own nations. So that's really what a lot of the measures you've seen in terms of basically the health space in the first instance. I don't think in Australia we should be that frightened of the FIRB changes. I think what the Treasurer is doing here is to make sure that the future that John and Malcolm have been talking about of businesses getting back to work quickly with people employed and fully engaged in commerce is what is underpinning that change. So it is about making sure that acquisitions ensure Australia's future through jobs, and to get matters through FIRB, which will deliver employment, will be quick and quite efficient. It's quite clear that that's their triage. So it's already from our experience with FIRB, if there is something that will protect a workforce, that will be expedited. I think at the same time there is messages coming from Treasury that opportunistic acquisitions of a more vulture type nature will not be warmly welcomed. But I don't think you've seen a shift in what the conversation that we'd had earlier in the year, Jennifer, around Australia recognising that it's part of a global community being driven by trade. We are a huge exporter of resources. I don't think that's the shift. I think it is part of the measures that John and Malcolm have been outlining of ensuring that we come out of this as quickly and strongly as possible. And while the statements are that there's potentially a delay of up to 6 months, that is not what will necessarily happen at all. It's really just more a matter of this triage, and a lot of matters will go through quite relatively efficiently. And certainly I think what we will see though is that and for those people over international participants, Australia's Foreign Investment Review Board has had focus of input from competition authorities, the taxation authority. And so what we're really overlaying here is the broader economic impact, which has always been part of FIRB. It's just been restricted by the level of the acquisitions that were involved.
Yeah. In terms of both the global financial crisis and this crisis, to what extent is Australia well served, and anyone can jump in on this one, by Australia's regulatory structure? Because we have what's called a Twin Peaks regulatory structure. John or Malcolm can explain it better than I can, but it was very influential, I think, during the global financial crisis. And following that, many countries around the world adopted this Twin Peaks model. John, how did you see it as helping in the global financial crisis, or did you see it helping at all or hindering?
Well, I probably have to declare a conflict of interest, since I spent 11 years trying to make sure that the model of integrated regulation in Australia, the Twin Peaks model, worked effectively. And the Twin Peaks, in our case, are a prudential regulator of banks, insurance and superannuation or pension schemes in one peak, and a securities and consumer regulator and market conduct regulator in a separate peak. And there are variations of this model throughout the world. Since I've left APRA, I do work for the International Monetary Fund on regulatory structures, including in the US, in the Euro area and some specific countries. And the lesson from all that is that there's just no one model that works for everybody. There's no single best practice model. The structure of regulation is important, but what we learned from the crisis was the effectiveness of prudential supervision that was most important. And effectiveness is shaped not just by institutional arrangements, but by questions like the independence of the regulator, the mandate, the confidence of the regulator, the supervisory intensity that's applied to problems. The crisis, the GFC exposed light touch regulators who didn't seem to have had an intense supervisory approach and had losses on their watch, and regulators like ourselves and the Canadians and the Singaporeans, who were tough regulators, and their banking systems, you know, in a sense reflected the quality of that supervision. So I wouldn't preach that one model suits everyone, and what I do preach when I'm working with the IMF is how important it is for supervisors with their clear mandate that they do the job effectively and they're well resourced. The structures have chopped and changed. So no one suits all. And even in the Australian case, what was an integrated regulator where industries were spread across different divisions is now much more like a banking silo, and a banking division, an insurance division, a pension funds division. So these institutional structures will change in response to a variety of conditions, but you've got to stay tough and focused. That's the message that I learned from our experience.
And John, I think the other thing that I would add to that is that what we have seen, which we also saw in the GFC, but we've seen extremely quickly here, is regulators responding to the circumstances. So for international guests, we were in a period of sort of intense regulatory scrutiny of the financial services sector immediately prior to this period. And I think what has happened is that there has been an immediate and prompt response from the regulators to recognise the extraordinary circumstances. So, for example, facilitating fundraising in an efficient fashion while still understanding and maintaining the prudential concepts that John's flagged. But that is absolutely essential in this sort of market, that you can move quickly to adjust so that where there are essential fundraising or prudent fundraising, it can be done efficiently, basically to keep the system whole and strong.
And part of that nimbleness, though, is not having too fragmented a regulatory system, because, you know, some jurisdictions, I think there were 130 regulators in the US that were somehow involved in the global financial crisis, or as Diana said, the GFC is what Aussies call the global financial crisis. So that's the GFC. Who is about to talk, John or Malcolm?
You know, I was just going to add to what Diana said. It's interesting that the focus on stability and the resilience of the banking system in Australia really was clouded for a long time by the conduct issues that were being addressed, serious conduct issues. But behind the scenes, APRA was still working with banks to build up capital to be unquestionably strong. That work doesn't get a lot of publicity, but it is so important that it was done, because then it puts APRA in a position where they can support banks in waiving or deferring, not waiving, but deferring payments from mortgagees or from business. It can support the banks because APRA knows the banks are strong and able to provide that support. So now, you know, that resilience is fundamental to the recovery process, but it's not being questioned, and certainly not being questioned in Australia. So, and I don't think around the globe that resilience has been an issue since all of the global reforms through Basel and other G20 initiatives have come into effect. That's, you know, hopefully one less issue we need to deal with in this very complex, this multi-layered crisis we're dealing with.
Yes, and I think, John, the operational strength, the focus on operational risk, has also probably assisted deal with the breadth of the issues, because I think, Jennifer, when we started this conversation, one of the things that does distinguish the current circumstances is just the breadth of industry affected and the flow-on effects, which it means that if everybody's turned their mind to operational risk, you're in a much stronger position. And I think other industries learnt from what the financial regulators have been leading.
Can I just add one more point to what's been said, and that is that there needs to be a mindset of cooperation amongst the regulators. John talked about how there are different models for the way regulatory responsibilities are divided up. There is no consensus on what's the best way to do that, but what you need is a mindset of cooperation, because in a crisis, things will come up that fall between the cracks between the different regulators, and they need to be able to work together with a common purpose. I think that's something that we did well in Australia in the GFC through the long-standing cooperative arrangements through the Council of Financial Regulators. Other countries might have different arrangements for doing that, but it's really the mindset on that that's important. And in a crisis, the overriding objective becomes financial stability, and sometimes you will have to do things that fall a bit between the cracks that are a bit unorthodox compared to previous things that you've done. The bank guarantees were an example of that, where the regulators working in cooperation with the government had to quickly come up with a scheme that would stabilise the banking system, and you need cooperation to be able to make that work effectively.
And you and John are still talking to each other 13 years on, so it's a good sign you cooperated well.
We retired gracefully as good friends.
I think the point, Jennifer,
Diana,
that Malcolm, the point that Malcolm was just making about that cooperation is right, but also the work that was done around the guarantees has meant that the Australian government has been able to respond very quickly in terms of its support for small business, and to build a new guarantee system, or a sort of a loss sharing system. But it's also, and I think you'll touch on this in your next session, Jennifer, recognise that the issues for directors are difficult in these circumstances because you're making very complicated judgments. And so, for example, extending safe harbour protection and insolvency. So I won't go there because I think you're going to go there later, but I just think that recognition and the learnings have been very helpful in this, at least in this hemisphere.
Yeah. And I think also that plays into what you're saying, Diana, plays into something that John mentioned earlier, which is how do you maintain trust in the community that everything's not going to fall apart? And so, some of those regulatory developments like the bank guarantee, were very, very important in that respect. Just on the point of regulation, we've been looking at national regulatory structure, but of course, during the global financial crisis, supranational regulation also became very important with the Financial Stability Board, IOSCO, and that's in the financial area. And of course, the World Health Organization, Steve, is very much in the news at the moment. What sort of role do you see for supranational institutions in this COVID-19 crisis? And I might start with you, Steve, in terms of the World Health Organization there.
Yeah, so, of course I can't speak for the sort of regulatory aspects in terms of economics, but in terms of the research, that international collaboration has been absolutely essential for being able to make the progress that we've been able to make as a community, scientific community, in one, understanding the virus, but also understanding its health impacts. And then also following on from that, then, the sort of research into therapies. So whether that be vaccines or novel drugs that could help treat or limit the infection. So without that collaboration, the sharing of resources and information, it would not have been possible to sort of progresses quickly and as far as we have. So it's absolutely essential in terms of the scientific community.
Okay, over to the finance people. Do you think that supranational organisations will have as big a role in the coming financial aspects of the crisis? John?
I won't answer that question directly because I'm not quite in my territory when I look at supranational bodies in health, but clearly multilateral cooperation is going to be essential in identifying a vaccine for COVID-19 and international cooperation in limiting the spread of the virus. Because if it's still active and strong in a country, it's going to be very hard for countries that trade with, visit, receive visitors from that country to maintain their own containment measures. So this is a virus it's global, it's pernicious, it's invisible, and the response to it has to be across the board. Now, what bodies bring that together, I'm not sure, but I agree with Steve that cooperation at every level, and it's taking place at the working level anyway, and Steve's highlighted that. That's critical because it will be as strong as the weakest link in this.
Sorry, Jennifer. Just in terms of
Steve, yeah.
just in terms of the World Health Organization, I mean that really is the peak body to help not just with facilitating networks of research, but also the implementation of health policy. So, particularly in jurisdictions that may be under-resourced in certain capacities. So the mobilisation, for example, of ventilators that are being manufactured in one jurisdiction that can be moved to another that really needs them. So the World Health Organization, I know that they've copped a bit of flack in terms of how they responded, but the problem is they're sort of damned if they do, damned if they don't in some respects. And certainly in my view, they acted appropriately and quickly enough to help mitigate what could have been more of a disaster than it already is in some respects.
Diana, you had a point?
No, I was just really going to comment that it is essential to really the point that John was making to getting international trade back, quickly and strongly, that there is cooperation. Having said that, I do think that this notion of the sovereign entity will have increased strength because there is an obligation to your own people, obviously, to protect them. So I think it's the combination of the two that's going to be critical.
Malcolm, do you have any points on that issue?
Yeah, I thought I might make a point about the financial aspect of it, because one of the things that was revealed in the GFC was the potential for international contagion of financial stress, and the way that the global regulatory community responded to that was to try to keep all the international networks intact, but to have a stronger set of uniform standards that would protect against instability in that environment. My personal view, which is probably a bit unorthodox in the regulatory community, is that actually there's too much internationalisation in banking and therefore too much scope, or in banking and finance generally, therefore too much scope for international contagion, and that it would make sense for at least a partial retreat towards more nationally isolated banking systems. If you think about it in terms of an analogy with a spreading fire, it's actually a good idea to have firewalls that prevent fires from spreading. And you can think of the same sort of concept with international banking and finance. It seems to me that there's some argument for at least creating partial firewalls to stop financial contagion. I don't know whether that idea will gain any traction or not, and it's quite different from the way that regulators responded to the GFC, but it's possible that it might gain some traction in this more sort of nationalistic environment.
Yeah. Steve, can I go back to you just to ask about, you made the point that obviously how well different jurisdictions are going to be able to deal with either the health or the financial aspects of this will depend also on their health systems and, health insurance systems, etc. Could you just say a few words about that? John and Malcolm have said there's no right way to structure regulation, but is there a right way to structure national health systems or some ways that are far superior to others?
Yeah, I must admit that's a bit outside my scope, but if we sort of take some observations, so there's sort of experiments that are going on within different parts of the globe. So an interesting sort of data set coming out is the spreads within Scandinavian countries. Where the Scandinavian countries are well resourced, they have excellent healthcare systems, but Sweden implemented a much more relaxed mitigation strategy. Not as many strategies, so not as many kind of processes, but also they did it a bit slower compared to Norway and Finland. And I just looked at the case load this morning, and Sweden is fast overtaking those Scandinavian neighbours. So it's not just about whether or not a country is well resourced necessarily, but how those things are organised and how they're implemented, and the compliance of the population as well. So Germany and Australia, I think, are two really good examples where there's been very strong compliance to the government policies implemented in terms of health response. And in Australia, we're at a point where there is some people suggesting that the virus might even kind of just run its course, wear out. I'm a bit doubtful about that for other reasons, which I can go into later if you're interested. Compare it to the United States, where there's been a lot of press about how they're struggling, particularly in places like New York. That's, I think, two reasons. One is they didn't seem to get on top of the infection quickly enough. So that ability to kind of nip it in the bud, it was just too late. So the horse had bolted, for want of a better term. But then, the way that the sort of health system is organised there, so it's talking about the drop in sort of the supply chain. In the United States, a lot of insurance is linked to being employed. So as soon as people were laid off, they didn't have access to their health insurance, and therefore they have to go through the public system in the US, which at times is highly stressed. So I think that all those factors are combining to make it very difficult to control at this time point.
And requires bigger government to, deal with the unemployment, etc., as opposed to the JobKeeper approach in Australia, where you just pay employers to keep people on.
Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Yeah. So one point that I just wanted to raise with Diana, John and Malcolm is the distinctive role of superannuation in Australia and the extent to which you think it played a protective role in the global financial crisis and what we're seeing now. So, Australia's pension funding is done through this very distinctive superannuation system, and it's the fourth largest retirement funding pool in the world. It's very, deep funding. So could I just ask, Malcolm, I might start with you and then go to Diana and John afterwards about, what you see the role of superannuation, or did it have a role in the global financial crisis? Does it have a role now?
I don't know enough about what was happening with super in the GFC, but I do have a comment about the situation with super at the moment, because I think that there's a potential problem there in the sense that from the point of view of the member, superannuation is entirely liquid. You can withdraw your funds, or you can, with the click of a mouse, you can change your asset allocation into safe assets if you feel that that's the thing to do in a crisis. I think there's a problem, and it's been debated in the media, to do with the fact that superannuation funds invest significantly in illiquid assets, in infrastructure and property. And if enough people decide that they want to allocate away from that, then super funds are going to have trouble valuing those assets in a way that treats all members equitably. I'd be interested in any comments John might have about how that can be dealt with, whether super funds have the power to restrict reallocations or whether the regulator has a role in that. But it's one of those situations that sometimes comes up in finance where there's no problem if nobody panics, but if enough people panic, there can be a problem and there needs to be a regulatory response.
John, do you want to respond to that?
Well, the issue that Malcolm's raised has been an issue in finance in Australia in the past with mortgage trusts, which at the time offered a fairly immediate redemption, even though the assets were invested in long-dated mortgages. And those funds were, and many of them were frozen in the global financial crisis. And I think some of the redemption arrangements in some of the superannuation funds have been quite short term in their nature and clearly under review. I'm not sure, it's not my area of expertise, but in the crisis itself, our focus was really on the banking system, and the immediate concern that was ultimately addressed by the government guarantee was whether or not the community would maintain confidence in keeping their funds in banks. And we saw a run on a bank at Northern Rock in the United Kingdom to remind people about the notion of a bank run, and that it could still happen in a modern retail system, and in the United Kingdom with a bank that was subject to deposit insurance. So that was really our focus. And when we looked at superannuation, for those who are less than the retirement age, it wasn't an asset that they could draw down. What has changed in the recent period is that the government has provided scope for people to draw down before retirement, and that has changed the liquidity profile. But that's sort of come really unexpectedly, and so superannuation funds wouldn't have been looking at that kind of shock to their flows. They would be looking at regular input from superannuation guarantee funds, which was providing regular funding into the superannuation funds, which they then felt confident to invest in longer dated assets. So that profile has been changed in a sense by force majeure, and it's required to have a look, required everyone to have a look at how you plan for something like that.
Yeah. Diana?
I think just a couple of other thoughts. Obviously, if people are allowed to access their funds, then we end up with this really very huge buffer of retirement savings being reduced. It's also being reduced by asset price reductions. That will put pressure on some of the funds, and I think there will put more pressure on some merger of those funds. But the longer term impact is, of course, they are huge investors, both in our economy and in foreign economies, as many of the other countries have. And, we've seen the power and force of some of the Canadian pension funds, for example, and they are absolutely critical to infrastructure. Curiously in Australia, that does provide an enormous buffer because by and large, they own our airports, for example,
right,
and no one's at the airports. So it's in fact been a very safe place for those assets to have been owned by owners that can hopefully withstand these sorts of conditions. So I think there's just, it's a good example, Jennifer, of the complexity of the issues that this sort of crisis is throwing up for people to manage, and really the need for sort of input from all sorts of different aspects.
Yeah. Well, just in the time that we have left, just as a wrap up, I'd like to ask you all your best predictions for the future. I know that a lot of my European and North American friends were emailing me in January saying, oh, you're so lucky you're in summer in Australia, and you're not experiencing what we're experiencing. But of course, the COVID-19 crisis seemed to flourish in Australia, seemed to flourish in Singapore, both of which were hot at that time. So it does not seem, that it was a winter disease, Steve. You mentioned, Steve, that you didn't think there would be a clean end to this. And so I want to ask everybody, if there isn't a clean end to this, if we are dealing with this over the long term, is that what you think will happen, and how do we deal with it? And we've got about 6 minutes for that big question. So if I can start with you, Steve, and then move through everybody.
Yeah, well, maybe I can just sort of outline what I sort of think will happen. So the fact that we've been able to control it here in Australia, it's a double-edged sword. Because what it means is that even though the virus isn't now spreading as prevalent, as much as it was, it means that a lot of the population is still susceptible if there is reintroduction of the virus. So of course, how we manage that sort of gentle or slow introduction of the virus into the population is going to be the key question. And of course, that flows on to things like international travel. Do we ban people from coming altogether until there's a vaccine, which may or may not happen? Eventually, I think this virus will become what we call seasonal, where it will become part of the sort of natural variation cycle of infections that we see over the winter. And there's already 5 human coronaviruses that cause common cold symptoms. But until we reach that point where most of the population is immune, how we manage that sort of exit from this is going to be a bit bumpy, I think.
Yeah. Malcolm, your predictions for how we manage this if it's a long-term health crisis that we're dealing with?
Yes, thanks. I started off by saying this is a supply shock and it's going to pose some unpleasant trade-offs. And I think the longer this goes on, the more true that will be. The policy institutions in Australia are responding to that by throwing a lot of money at it. And I think that's the right policy. But the consequence of that is probably, I think, we are going to have to tolerate higher inflation for a while during the recovery period as things get back to normal. So I think that the policy institutions have got a difficult job calibrating that to get the best trade-off we can. It won't be ideal. We've lost some output. But in macroeconomic terms, when you have a supply shock, the consequence of that is less output and more inflation, and we're going to have to endure some of that for a while yet.
Diana and then John.
I think that we all understand that this is not short term, and so in a mergers and acquisition space, it will be who can take the opportunities and move forward and learn. And there are, on an optimistic note, we're all learning to do things in a very different fashion as we're doing this morning. Some of that will drive speed and innovation and opportunity, but I think that as Malcolm sort of flagged, the question is really how long you can manage the really material impact on supply and what that really how destructive that is.
Yeah. And John, if we could just have your views.
Well, there's no playbook in this area. This is a shock none of us have any experience in, far more extreme than the global financial crisis, where we thought we could understand the macroeconomics of it. I don't think there'll be a point at which there'll be a VJ celebration or people out in the streets cheering. I think the timetable for this will be determined by the discovery and production of a vaccine, and how long and how severe the knock-on effects are up to that point really depends on human behaviour. How long will we be able to maintain these social distancing restrictions, the sort of restraints on our freedoms that we would not have otherwise expected to confront in our society, and will we be willing to do that in the interest of preserving the health of our future and older generations? So, human behaviour is going to be critical to that, and we just don't know. We just don't know how long we can hold this.
Well, we're going to end the first panel there. We could have talked forever. I'm sorry to be ending this panel. I've learned a huge amount. Thank you all so much. I'm sure everyone that's listening at home is very grateful. And so I'm going to ask you guys to leave the room, and we're going to start again in 5 minutes with our second panel. But thank you all so much. That was wonderful.
Thank
you, Jennifer.
Bye. Okay, welcome back everyone. We are now about to start our second panel. If I could just ask all the people on my panel to unmute and to put their videos on so we can see them. The speakers for this second panel, we're going to be dealing with the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on boards of directors and regulators. and we have a new panel, and let me introduce them. We have Priscilla Bryans. Priscilla is a Senior Corporate Governance Partner from Herbert Smith and Freehills in Melbourne. Sylvia Falzon. Sylvia is a non-executive director at a number of companies at Suncorp Group, Regis Healthcare and Premier Investments Limited. Kevin McCann. Kevin is the chair of Telix Pharmaceuticals Limited, and he's the former chair of Macquarie Bank Australia. And John Price. John is a commissioner at the Australian Securities and Investments Commission, otherwise known as ASIC in Australia. So in the second panel, we're going to be looking at how things are changing in Australian companies and for Australian directors as a result of the COVID-19 crisis. And, you know, right back to the early 1930s when Burley and Means wrote their pivotal book, The Modern Corporation and Private Property, in that book they said that there is a tension between a private and a public role for corporations, and that they really didn't know how corporate law would develop, whether it would become a purely private area of law or whether it would become a public area of law. And I think at the moment in Australia, well, probably for the last 2 years, we've really seen that tension between a completely private view of the corporation and a public view, both as a result of a very high profile Banking Royal Commission that a final report came out last year in 2019, looking at some misconduct in the banking arena, which had harmed customers. And we're also seeing it with the COVID-19 crisis, this idea of, well, how much should companies step up to support the public interest? And so I want to get started by asking some of the panelists, and I think I'll start with you, Priscilla. What do you see as the real impact of the COVID-19 crisis on boards of directors and directors' responsibilities to their companies?
Well, great question and a huge one. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what Kevin and Sylvia have to say to this with their practical lens. But I think directors are required to act with due care and diligence, and that concept of reasonableness, what would the reasonable person do in your circumstances, in your company, with your resources, is necessarily a fluid concept. And so in that way, our law works very well. When you apply the test of what's reasonable, you're allowed to take into account all of the circumstances. So limited timeframes, limited resources, and the like. And I think what we're starting to see in Australia now is a real question around what does acting in the best interests of the company actually mean? Our law is quite fluid again there. Acting in the best interest of the company doesn't necessarily mean the current shareholders. It does allow a company to take into account future shareholders. And we've seen this tension. The previous session talked a lot about the Australian superannuation industry and the fact that a large amount of Australian funds are floating around our economic system looking for good returns for all of our futures. And that has over the past put quite a bit of pressure on companies to focus their funds on returning distributions and ensuring that everyone's pension funds are growing. But at the same time, there's been quite a growing voice of concern from some companies saying, well, actually, continuing to invest in the future, capital investments, research and development, you know, is it really appropriate to be distributing everything? Should we be holding a bit back? I think then the Royal Commission built on that. Is it enough to return money to shareholders at the cost of everybody? Clearly not, because you end up destroying your company's own image and brand. And that in itself then deteriorates the profits and the future of the company. So clearly you have to think about the long term there. And I think COVID-19 has really just escalated this debate. And so one other factor that was also adding to that debate was environmental issues and sustainability issues. You know,
Sure.
You can a lot of money producing plastics, but you know, to what end and the like. So I think COVID-19 really has further escalated a debate that was already well and truly underway. And I think where companies now are sitting, it's tough. So we've seen in the UK, banks have been told not to distribute profits, no dividends. Here, our regulator has said you can, but you have to have a really long, hard look at yourself and do quite a bit of stress testing before you do. So that puts that responsibility back on the boards.
That was APRA's announcement, was it, Priscilla?
Correct.
Yeah, so the Australian Prudential Regulation Authority made that announcement very recently, warning banks to materially reduce their dividends. Yeah. And
also in a very quiet way, telling them not to pay any cash bonuses. There was a little byline thrown in that announcement. Right. So long story short, I think directors have always had a lot of competing demands to consider. It is a very nuanced job to make decisions that are reasonable. And I think these are difficult and complicated times.
Well, let's ask our two directors how they're doing this juggling act. Sylvia and Kevin, how do Priscilla's words resonate with you on the ground as company directors? Priscilla, do you want to go first?
Sylvia, thank you, Priscilla, for a great opening remarks. I think you're absolutely right. We've always had competing issues around stakeholders and who are we really serving, and I think that has come to the fore in the last couple of years. And I take heart when I think about, I sit on listed, unlisted, not-for-profit, and I think the COVID-19 has been a real moment in time when I've kind of seen for the first time all boards galvanise around that first principle of what is the right thing to do by our people? How do we keep our people safe? And it's interesting because in another time we could have had very different decisions about, what does this mean financially, and what would this mean for our dividends, and all sorts of other questions which are not insignificant or immaterial. But I think in terms of how we've looked at this, we've really been able to think about that fundamental question about what is the right thing for this organisation. And when you really dig deep into that about who you are and your purpose, it's no surprise why then you first and foremost think about the safety and well-being of our people, our customers, their families, and then you manage the consequences of that after those issues. So it's been interesting to observe in very different ways and very different organisations have had to make really tough decisions of one firm standing down 9,000 people to another. I'm a chairman of a major hospital as well, and just seeing how the consistency of that, albeit in a different way, has really, I feel, from my perspective, really made it clear to why we're here and why we exist, and the importance of trying to get this as right as we can to hopefully come out the other end as resilient as we can be. And I think for me, that's certainly been my initial experience thus far.
Kevin, your companies that you're involved in, you're involved in a startup, I think.
Yeah, it's a life science startup, Jennifer. I probably you've really raised the philosophic question of the public-private nature of a corporation, and I'd make perhaps a couple of remarks. If you look at the banking sector, I think it may be that the banks are going to be the backstop for the community. If you look at say the sequence, you've got commercial tenants who are being favoured over landlords under legislation that the states are bringing. The landlords, to the extent they're geared, are going to be looking to their banks to be a backstop. And certainly in the investment community, there's real concern about the fact that when we come out eventually from this crisis, that the banks will be slower to recover because they're absorbing a lot of the social issues, the people who can't pay their mortgages, the people who are going to need deferred interest arrangements because if you're a landlord, you're not getting your rents. I suppose the thing I'd like to just briefly touch on is how life is different, as Sylvia said, for a director. And like her, I sit on a variety of boards, the private sector, but also Sydney Opera House, which is completely closed. And we had to shed 800 employees who were casuals, the people who look after people at performances. So that organisation is completely shut. And we've got cultural organisations that can't perform, and as a result, they have no revenue. So trying to accommodate their problems has been a challenge. But what might be of interest is what's it like to be a director today? Well, firstly, we're operating remotely. And what does that mean? It means that we can't see our colleagues. We haven't met physically for several weeks. We can't see customers. We can't see shareholders. We can't see employees. We can't see our suppliers. We can't travel overseas, and we can't attend conferences. And then the second thing is that, as Priscilla's pointed out, we've got to consider the role of the directors in a crisis. And the thing we need to take into account is the risks that the organisation is running. And I agree absolutely with Sylvia that our top priority has been our employees. The private sector acted much more quickly than government to work remotely. We were all working remotely. I know the big law firms shut down early, and I know that the banks did, and the accounting firms, and so we did that long before the shutdown occurred. So employees and their welfare has been really important. A lot of effort's gone into making sure they're physically and psychologically cared for. But then we get into the survival situation. When you're a startup, you begin to look at your cash flow. Have we got the cash flow to get through this? The last thing you want to do is to have an equity issue. So we've been very transparent with the market, and I think communication is important. We can talk about that later. But we've told the market we've got enough money to last till the end of next year. You also have to review corporate business plans. You look at operational issues. In our case, the supply chain. In the pharmaceutical industry, the supply chain is cross-border, extremely complex, and that has come to a halt. You've got to look at cost reductions and the question of how you take out unnecessary costs. Certainly, the corporations I'm involved with, headcount is the last thing we're looking at. We are not moving, apart from the Opera House, in the private sector. We are not looking to reduce headcount at this point of time. And then market communication, which is a rich issue that John probably has some views on. But I suppose the point I'd make is that the role of the directors is much harder than it was in the GFC. The role of boards, all of my boards now have subcommittees which meet every fortnight to talk to management about what is occurring in the business. And the role of the chairman has been raised enormously. The chair now has to be in constant touch with the chief executive and executives to make sure that the leaders of our organisations are coping with the strains and stresses.
Thanks very much. Now, I just want to go back to Priscilla's point about the director's duty to act in the best interests of the company. And I want to go to you now, John, because I understand that has been quite a focal point for ASIC in relation to capital raisings. And I just wondered if you could say something to us about that.
Yeah, so in Australia, there's quite a broad range of mechanisms by which companies can raise capital. Prospectus raisings, we have accelerated offerings that are based on our continuous disclosure system, dividend reinvestment plans, share purchase plans, whole range of different choices companies have when they raise capital. And there's a very interesting debate that's happening in the Australian market at the moment when I read the papers about retail investors in particular being concerned that that fundraising choices that are being made, particularly around accelerated offerings, may end up diluting existing shareholders. And I think it really shines a sharp light on the point that we were discussing before. The obligation in Australia is to act in the best interests of the company, not necessarily in the best interests of a particular class of shareholders that exist in the present moment. That said, you know, I think I agree certainly with my fellow panelists' observations that there is much broader, I think, expectations on company directors now about taking into account a more expansive range of interests. So issues like fairness, company legitimacy in terms of how a company acts in respect of its investors and its customers are issues that have been strongly raised in Australia over the past few years, including through the Financial Services Royal Commission. And I do also want to strongly endorse the points that have been made that I think COVID-19 is actually perhaps likely to accelerate this public-private debate, because at its heart, COVID-19, on one view, is not a financial issue, it's really a health issue. And so it's going to heighten, I think, scrutiny around issues like prioritising the safety of employees, meeting broad community standards at a time when the circumstances are very difficult, and so on. So I think the earlier comments from my fellow panellists are right on point as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, John, if I could just follow up there with all the panellists. This idea coming out of the Banking or the Financial Services Royal Commission that John was talking about of, saying the banks did have a public role. One thing that we're seeing in COVID-19 now is a certain amount of collaboration between competitors in particular industries. And so in the supermarket industry, making sure we're all fed while we're at home. In the bank's medical technology. And, in order to collaborate rather than, compete as we traditionally think companies should do, they've been needing to get ACCC or the competition watchdog's approval. The head of the chairman of the ACCC has said that there is a need to fight, quote, a common enemy. And so a sense of national purpose, coordination is both efficient and carries little or no downside. So a number of these competing companies have now got these urgent interim authorizations to be able to collaborate. Any views on that? Is that good? Should we make it easier for them to be able to collaborate rather than compete? Sylvia.
Well, I could probably talk with recent experience of that very issue. Being the chairman of Cabrini, which is a major health organisation, a private organisation, people would recall, for the benefit of our international guests, about 2 weeks ago, the federal government here cancelled what we call elective 2 and 3 surgery. Now, to put that into context, that's about 70% of our revenue. That literally went overnight. And at the same time, though, saying that you cannot allow any of your clinical staff to be stood down. So on one hand, you've got revenue that's just literally been decimated for all good reason, and absolutely good reason, to create capacity in the system. But at the same time, you have to keep all of your frontline available and and ready to go. So as a consequence of that, what occurred was all the private operators, so that is a whole lot of not-for-profits, faith-based, listed entities, got together, and we in fact took one voice through to the state government via the Department of Health and Human Services about how is this going to work, and we really need to do this in a very consistent way. So all of a sudden, all of the issues that we would have had, months ago about competing with each other were absolutely put to one side, and everyone came to the table with the spirit of saying, we're here to help, and we have to help, because the private system is 1 in 4 beds, and we have capacity that absolutely needs to be made available. And that was mobilised, the heads of agreement was mobilised within about 3 or 4 days, and we all signed. And now we're just going through the finer detail. And what it really means is that no one's here to make money. We're here just to recover our costs and to make all of our services available. So I think that is just a great example of what is possible when you do see a crisis. And as John said, this is a health crisis first and foremost. And then what you just need to do to come behind and support, governments and other, leaders that are making some pretty tough decisions.
Yeah. Kevin or Priscilla, do you have any comments on this point?
Priscilla, why don't you go first?
I would say, it's fantastic to see everybody cooperating. I think it's wonderful. It's not the first time. We didn't always have to have a crisis to do that. So if I think of another example, things like modern slavery and workshops, the garment industry, the fashion industry have worked together for a very long time to come up with a code of conduct to try and stamp out workshops, sort of slave labour or sweatshops. And that's a situation where, in fact, the first mover to do the right thing has a disadvantage. And I think, obviously trying to stamp out sort of anti-competitive behaviour is important, but it's awful if the consequences are that people can't work together to try and actually improve a situation and set up a set of code of conduct or guidelines so that there isn't a first mover disadvantage for people trying to do the right thing. So I would hope that this COVID-19, these sorts of great examples actually lead to more cooperation between organisations in our other areas.
Kevin?
Yeah, look, I think Sylvia's really given us a very good case study. Our experience is our product is used in compassionate treatment and diagnosis for cancer. And unfortunately, because everyone is focused on the COVID-19 emergency, very sick people are missing out on treatment. So it's a dilemma which is going to have to be addressed. At the moment, COVID-19 is getting all the attention, and our clinicians and frontline staff are really, really exhausted. So I don't know what's going to happen to people with cardiac issues, people with cancer. Cancer doesn't stop because of COVID. People are dying, and unfortunately can't get access to this some of our products because of supply chain problems.
We're seeing increased public-private interaction as well. One very famous Australian company, RM Williams, which is known for its boots and its slouch Australian hats, it's now, manufacturing, or it's about to, I think, protective equipment. It's in collaboration with the South Australian government. Do you think we'll see a lot more of this? And I guess, do you think we'll see business bailouts where the government will then get a greater stake in the companies that it's bailing out, which of course we didn't see in the Australian banking system in the global financial crisis, but plenty of people did in North America and Europe? Kevin, do you want to start on that point?
Yeah, look, I think this goes to the supply chain question, and it's really complex because to date it's been global, and in the pharma industry it is very elongated supply chains. Product is made in Minnesota, goes to Alabama, then it's flown to Austria. Nuclear isotopes come from Munich, and then the products shipped around the world in planes. Now, the challenge to say, well, we're going to go back to making products ourselves, and we won't rely upon the most efficient producer is a difficult one, and I think we'll need to be highly selective about those items or products and services which we want to promote domestically. So I'm sitting on the fence here. I'm not sure how long RM Williams is going to make protective clothing versus someone else who makes it cheaper and better.
Sylvia?
Yeah, it's it's not an easy question in terms of the answer, because what we're dealing with here is, well, take the RM Williams example, and we're seeing a lot of even distilleries converting to becoming massive kind of hand sanitizer producers. So there's kind of now a bit of a flood of product. But I think the issue here is an opportunity for an organisation to pivot, when they've actually got the ability to do that. As Kevin said, to the extent of the duration of that, I think only time will tell, because, you know, your organisations are built up over many, many years of your DNA about what it is that you do and your purpose, and you can't kind of just unwind that kind of overnight. And you can do these things differently for a period, but then it's a bit about, well, now what? And how do we create a sustainable organisation that may in fact be different, because you can't go back to doing what you're going to do, what you were doing, you know, previously. So I do think, as a consequence of what we're going through, some businesses will not survive. I think that is, you know, something that we really have to just accept as part of, you know, this process. But we'll see other businesses kind of come out of this and you know, be incredibly successful, but albeit in a very different way. And someone said to me the other day, for all of us as we went into this, we're not going to come out the same way. We're all going to come out different, and we're all going to be thinking differently, and there'll be different leadership, because there's been a lot of leaders of the past that really became incredibly successful because they were very good at the financial part of organisations. And this is actually creating very different leadership requirements of people. And I suspect for some, it's kind of a bit of a new world, you know, for them. So this whole concept of a bailout, I think it really needs to be thought about. To what extent are you doing a bailout for the sustainability of that business within a sector that's absolutely needed? And I think this is going to be the prioritisation that will need to take place. And if governments do need to take an equity stake, you know, they're only decisions for those parties to be making. But if the end game is that there's a need for that business to exist longer term, because it does serve a really important role within our economy or in our community, or providing certain services, well then if that's the net result, well then I think there is going to be circumstances where that will occur. I suspect that will be on the fringe. It won't be kind of at a wholesale level. Yeah. Because there's the other issue too, is there's still a lot of capital around. There's what we've called scared capital, but there's always going to be people that have got what we call brave capital. So we've got to kind of still remember that the capital just hasn't, you know, vaporised. It's there. It's just people's willingness to place it. So I think it will just take some time for people to get confidence that they do want to actually put their capital to work again.
And John Laker talked about that in our first session, the importance of, you know, trust for people to go back to investing. Priscilla, any comments on this sort of public-private, or the other thing I wanted to ask you was, you know, we have a comply or explain corporate governance, you know, recommendations, we call them if not, why not, for the Australian Securities Exchange. And last year we brought out the 4th edition of that, but there was a lot of controversy because the draft had a reference to listed companies having a social license to operate. And the business world didn't like that, and it was ultimately left out of the final draft. Have we come to a point in the COVID-19 crisis where, whether we've got it in those ASX corporate governance principles and recommendations or not, businesses do have a social license to operate, given what Sylvia's been telling us? Priscilla?
It was the particular phrase, social license to operate, that people seem to object to. The final text in the 4th edition was reworded, but I think to all intents and purposes, it says exactly the same thing. And it's what we've already just been discussing, i.e. companies don't operate in a vacuum. And what they do. And social media is the great leveler. Everyone can see what companies are doing. And you know, I'm looking at advertisements on the television at the moment, and there are big companies out there reassuring us that they're paying their bills on time so that the suppliers don't fall under, and investing in the future and keeping their staff on. So I think social license to operate is just one way of saying the same thing, which is being a good corporate citizen. And that isn't at the expense of, you know, returning money to shareholders. Shareholder primacy will always exist. It's legitimate to take into account.
Yeah.
Well, and the wording that it was changed to, Priscilla is right. They took out the social license to operate and put in lots of references to reputation, etc. So I think the chair of the ASX Corporate Governance Council, she said it's pretty much the same thing, Elizabeth Johnston. I want to move to John Price. I wanted to ask you, John, about the role of institutional investors in the Australian markets. We talked in the first panel about the fact that it is a huge, it's a huge fund of retirement savings, fourth largest in the world. How do you see the role of institutional investors playing out in all of this from your vantage point with the regulator?
Well, look, I can only speak with perhaps some memories of the GFC, but I think they will potentially play a very important role because during the GFC, when additional capital was required, it was really that pool of institutional investors that were able to provide it. And so really one of ASIC's fundamental goals, I think, in the work we do, is making sure that our markets are open, are liquid, and that people can have confidence in the disclosure that's being provided to those markets, because all those things will go to the cost of capital that institutional investors will sort of make the deal on. So I think the sort of unique situation in some ways of the Australian market and institutional investors in particular has stood us in very good stead. And I certainly hope that's going to be the case again as we proceed through these extraordinary circumstances we see with COVID-19.
I have had a question come through the Q&A box from my colleague Steve Carabas at Monash. Hi, Steve. Steve's question is this. It's before the crisis, the question of trust in corporations and boards resulting from corporate misconduct scandals in various sectors and jurisdictions was a major issue. Do you think actions of corporations and boards during the crisis, and I think he's talking about this one, the COVID-19 crisis, will affect trust in corporations, and how? So we've, to some degree, been skirting around that issue, but, can we answer Steve's question more directly? Priscilla?
I don't know if this is one that's in my bailiwick, but I think this is a great opportunity for the banks to reclaim some of the they do so much for our economy, and the Royal Commission into Misconduct in the Financial Services sector had a really detrimental effect on their brand, if you like, the trust levels in banks. And I think this is an opportunity for them to prove they're the spine of our economy and they're there to look after us. So I think, it's an opportunity.
Thanks, Priscilla. Kevin, you've been chair of Macquarie Bank. Is that the role that you think the banks are there to look after us all?
Well, I think actually, Jennifer, whether they like it or not, that's the role they're going to be cast in. As I said before, if you look at the situation with tenants, landlords are going to bear the risk of tenants, and then in turn, landlords who are unable to meet commitments to banks will have to be given a generous treatment. So I think what is that the banks are going to be forced to have a look at. They're going to prioritise the interests of their customers over the interests of their shareholders. So they're going to accumulate non-performing loans. They won't do what happened in 1990, where they foreclosed on customers who didn't meet their commitment. I think there'll be some lenient. Part of that is because there's going to be legal restrictions on their right to foreclose. So I think so far the banks are shaping up as doing a pretty good job. And you've seen that in the case of dealing with that capital point that you raised, some very large Australian corporations raised very large amounts of debt. Qantas, for instance, both equity and debt, and organisations like Cochlear, equity and debt. So the banks have really stepped up and provided liquidity to Australian corporations who felt they needed it. So I would say the banks are on the way to redeeming themselves and overcoming some of the misdeeds in the past. Now, as for the rest of us, I think the two big consumer organisations providing staples to our community have bent over backwards to try and be even-handed and look after their customers. So I think corporate Australia at the moment gets a tick.
Right, so it gets it. Redemption is good. Sylvia, did you have comments on redemption of corporate Australia?
Yeah, I would have to endorse Kevin's comments. And I think, I mean, we can sit here and have a view, but really it's the consumers who will decide whether they trust us or not. And that comes by our actions and our behaviours. And I think this is, you know, if you think about standing back and how Australia has responded to this universally, I think most people, when you kind of match us up against kind of other places, you'd have to say that we've been very proactive. In fact, as Kevin mentioned earlier, in fact, many private organisations went before, you know, government had imposed certain regulations about, you know, the protection and initiating things in a way that we just felt was just the right thing to do. So I think in many regards that feedback and creating confidence within our system is going to be so important about people getting back to doing whatever it's going to be afterwards. So I do feel that this has been a kind of a pivotal moment of having gone through and being on boards of an insurer and a bank and financial service organisation, kind of going through that part and seeing really evidence-based behaviour and actions that you would say that we are in a better position. I can't say that, you know, it's going to be perfect, but we are certainly in a much better position to show the importance of the role that we all play, you know, within our community. So I'm with Kevin. I'd give us a tick. I'm not sure if it's a really big tick, but I'd certainly be putting more of a tick in the box than what I would have a month or two ago.
Very good. And John, just over to you now. ASIC is really playing an unprecedented role in the COVID-19 crisis, from what I understand. And I just wondered if you could fill us in on what you see as some of the really critical regulatory issues coming out of this for the organisation.
Well, I've probably talked about some of them today. So I think it is very important that we keep our capital markets open, that the flow of disclosure through to those capital markets is robust and people feel they can trust that, because that will go to cost of capital. I think there are a whole range of issues that social distancing are demonstrating, where the law as it's drafted in a different era perhaps is under strain. So, for example, annual general meetings in Australia, absent some recent changes, a purely virtual annual general meeting, I think, was quite legally questionable whether you could do it. I think issues around financial reporting and audit may also come to the fore. So we haven't seen it as a systemic issue at this point, and that's largely because the majority of our companies in Australia have 30 June year-end balance dates, which is a bit different to other parts of the world. I think there will be issues around liquidity of asset managers, so potentially in investment managers, and there'll need to be careful thought about where funds are frozen, how investors in severe hardship might be able to get some money out. So there are a whole raft, I think, of issues that come from, as I say, the extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in, And I think the role of the regulator is really to try and adopt a pragmatic approach that still respects the very important policy objectives and consumer protection objectives that are set out in the law, albeit we might try and achieve that through different means. And that's really the role that we're trying to perform at the moment.
And one very distinctive role that John's organisation ASIC plays in Australia, just for international watchers, most directors' duties cases are actually brought by the regulators. So we have both a public and a private enforcement regime for directors' duties, but the significant cases that are brought by ASIC and are public enforcement, which increases potentially risk for directors. And I want to just move now to some of the particular risks for Australian directors, particularly in the light of the fact that you've got an active regulator that has also been told by the Banking Royal Commission, you know, why not litigate? So that is something that directors are looking down the barrel of that gun from the Banking Royal Commission. But I know, Priscilla, that you've talked about continuous disclosure being a real issue for directors in Australia. So I wondered if you could say something about the risks associated with continuous disclosure, because I know the Australian Institute of Company Directors is very concerned about that.
Yes, thank you. Continuous disclosure in Australia has, I think it's described as the jewel in our crown of corporate governance regulation. Excuse me, we have a very, very strict disclosure obligation to immediately disclose price sensitive information as soon as a company becomes aware of it, unless there is a carve out. And the carve out is that it's still confidential, and then the usual exceptions are it's something that's still under negotiation or insufficiently definite to announce. But then there's a caveat also that the reasonable person would not expect you to say anything. And what the reasonable person expects can also change in a crisis. So, for example, during the global financial crisis back in 2008-9, it used to be considered okay to go and renegotiate your banking facilities with your bank if you might not be able to hit a target or a hurdle. But as companies started to fall off a cliff when debt dried up, suddenly what the reasonable person expected was that you would come to the market earlier and announce that you might have a problem, as opposed to you do have a problem. So it's a test that is a very simple sentence, but we have a guidance note that goes for over 90 pages explaining that one sentence. What does it mean in this situation? In Australia, directors sign off on the accounts. So unlike the US where management signs off on the accounts, the non-executive directors are personally accountable for the numbers that are published and have a duty to make sure that they understand the accounting principles and that they're right. We also have a misleading and deceptive conduct claim that can be made if you make a forward-looking statement without a reasonable basis for doing so. Of course, to have a reasonable basis to make a forward-looking statement, like upgrading or downgrading a forecast or guidance, that takes time. And so you need to get all your ducks in a row, test the numbers. Management might panic and come to you to say they think that we need to do a downgrade. Sometimes the board will push back and say, just test those numbers again. And actually it turns out that there isn't a need to downgrade, things are okay. So boards take that disclosure obligation very seriously. But what we also have at the same time is a class action system in Australia where, unlike in the US where you need to prove that there is an arguable case before you start the class action, here in Australia we can just start a class action on anything. And to date, we've only ever had one continuous disclosure class action go all the way to trial and decision. So what that means is that when directors say, we think we're going to come out of this okay, or we have solid assets at the moment and we think that we'll be able to trade through, they could potentially be liable if that sentence turns out not to be true on the basis that they didn't have a reasonable basis for making it. But if they don't say what the likelihood is, and then the share price dips when it turns out that things were harder than expected, a class action will get instigated, and that will be with the aim to settlement. And the company will end up spending a lot of money, and if they're lucky, they'll have directors and officers insurance that will cover side C or security holder actions as well. But it's a long and drawn out and complicated process. So what most companies in Australia are currently doing is, if they have had guidance out there, they are withdrawing it. That unfortunately leaves a vacuum of information for investors. It's necessary in the sense that the directors, everything is evolving so quickly, they don't know what to say. And they don't have a reasonable basis to be able to say anything of great certainty about the future at this point in time. But the information vacuum leaves the risk of a surprise in the future, a share price fall and a class action. So what the Australian Institute of Company Directors has proposed is that there is a moratorium on other people than our corporate regulator being able to bring actions against companies if they make announcements about the future and their likely prospects, and they have a genuine, they're making those announcements in good faith, effectively. So the proposal is that we all recognise that it's hard to have a reasonable basis to make a sort of a definitive statement about the future. But it is important that the information vacuum be filled. And if that statement doesn't end up being correct, provided that the directors then, do their best to correct the market as and when they can, class actions litigators are not able to be opportunist about the chance of having a negotiated settlement based on a share price. But the regulator, ASIC, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, continues to have all of its powers, obviously, to make sure that people are not doing the wrong thing.
Thanks, Priscilla. Can we just hear from the directors and the regulator from their perspective of the issues that Priscilla's just raised with us? Kevin, can I ask you to give your...
Priscilla's given an absolutely excellent account of what the AICD is seeking. I sit on their corporate governance committee and we had a meeting yesterday. There's a few issues that I just touch on quickly. The D&O market is broken. For companies in the financial sector, it's either not obtainable or unaffordable. And in the case of small companies, it's unaffordable, like $100,000 for 1 million cover. So we have a real issue for directors' liability. The measures that Priscilla's outlined in relation to continuous disclosure is excellent. The other area of concern is that we've got this unprecedented piece of legislation where the Treasurer can now amend the corporations law, and he's done that to permit insolvent trading, if it occurs, doesn't incur for 6 months personal liability for directors. That doesn't solve the accounts problem. As at 30 June, directors are going to have to sign accounts opining as to solvency and going concern. And again, the AIDC is seeking a safe harbour protection for directors acting in good faith and with appropriate due diligence, so that you don't have a situation where you're judged in hindsight if in fact that certificate turns out to be incorrect.
Thank you. John or Sylvia, would either of you have a comment on this continuous disclosure aspect, or can we move on to a few social responsibility issues?
Look, only to note from my part that there was an Australian Law Reform Commission report in the last year or two that specifically looked at various issues, including litigation funding and class actions, and my understanding is that that report is with the Attorney General at present.
Thanks. So I just wanted to ask you, I think we mentioned climate change earlier on, and I certainly don't want it to be left as a coda at the end, but somehow it is here at the end. Priscilla talked about how climate change, CSR issues had become very important in Australia. Do you think that they will continue to be important and will be bound up with this sort of more public view of the corporation that we're coming to in COVID-19? Or are they going to get crowded out? Is everything going to get crowded out by COVID-19? And I also, we haven't talked about executive pay. I just wonder, in a world where there will be winners and losers and where there will be this increasing wealth disparity, how are things going to change in that regard? So, Sylvia, can I just ask you to come in on that first?
Sure. Firstly, I don't think climate change or other CSR issues will get crowded out. I think, you know, directors are used to dealing with lots of points in time, and I think it will be just as important now to be looking at these issues as they were in the past. So I don't feel that there is going to be a prioritisation of, we don't have time to deal with that, let's just park it for 6 months and pick it up then, because I think you would do that at your peril, because I think these things are parallel issues and again, really important fundamental issues to an organisation. In terms of remuneration, I tend to chair and sit on most REM committees on my boards, and I have to say that in all situations, we've had things from directors not taking remuneration together with the CEO and the executives over a period of time to reductions in remuneration over a period. I think it's fair to say here in Australia, anyone expecting that a short-term incentive is going to be paid this year would like to wake up from that dream, because that's the chances of that occurring are going to be incredibly remote. And you know, long-term incentives, I think, will be an interesting conversation, because again, all incentives are at the discretion of a board. And I think these are really important times where you just have to stand back and go, while someone may have been entitled to something, really, how does that, can we defend that payment, and how can we justify that given the context of what's going on? So I think there will be quite a conversation to be had around there. Some things around REM are more black and white. Other things I think are more going to be up for debate and kind of questioning about, you know, how we opine those decisions. What I will say finally, I think for the first time ever, there's going to be people galvanised around teachers, healthcare workers, and what they get paid relative to others. So, you know, we may, and I'm kind of one of these hopeful optimists to think there might be some recalibration around value that these people actually have within our community, because for so long we've had it just has not been allocated in a way that is, I think anyway, fair and reasonable. So that's it from me.
Yeah. Kevin?
Yeah, REM is one topic that does need to be re-examined, as Sylvia said. I think that where you begin to reduce headcount, where you begin to stand people down, where you begin to put them on instead of 5 days a week, 2 or 3 days a week, it would be unthinkable that there wasn't a similar reduction in salary for CEOs and senior executives, and boards should also follow suit. Sylvia, I find that management a lot of management still is in dream world. And there are remuneration structures which, in the financial services, still in the bad old days, because they're wholesale, they're not retail. And getting changed that mindset is, I'm probably going to lose most of my hair, and what is left will be greyer. It's really, that entitlement is really entrenched.
Priscilla.
I think my observation would be that where companies are trying to manage cash, and that will be important from many businesses, equity is a good option. Hopefully this is a crisis that has a period of effect, but then we all come out the other side. And in a way, providing equity to staff and having them have a stake in the future is one way to encourage all of us to keep on keeping on and come out the other side. Having said that, of course, everyone needs cash for their daily essentials. So it'll all be horses for courses.
Thanks. And John?
Thank you, Jenny. Look, on climate change, I'd make a point that I suppose to my mind it's not necessarily just a corporate social responsibility issue. I think a range of regulators in Australia, APRA, the Reserve Bank and ASIC have all made the point that climate change may have a very real financial impact on some companies. So I don't expect for that reason the focus on climate change will necessarily go away anytime soon. On the point about remuneration, I just wanted to take up Kevin's comment about greying hair. And I suppose if I was to say something about remuneration, it's just to note that generally each board has at its disposal an overarching discretion in relation to executive pay outcomes. And I'd encourage boards to make sure they're getting sufficient information when considering those sorts of discretions, that they have access to independent and objective advice, and they've got a sort of decision-making framework, so you're not coming at the issue from first principles every time. So,
well, thank you, everyone. Milton Friedman once said, there is enormous inertia, a tyranny of the status quo in private and especially governmental arrangements. Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. From everything you've been saying, we are at that crisis point that is going to produce real change. We do have 2 Q&As. I'm going to look at those and send them to the speakers that I think they're most relevant to. But I think we're going to have to sign off from Australia at this point. Some of you I know will be moving to Tokyo and Seoul, and I'll be joining you there in half an hour's time. Thank you very much to the speakers, the panelists. This has been a wonderful panel. Thank you so much.